Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode of our Orchid Care series designed for beginners. Today, we will attempt to save and rejuvenate these orchids. Some of you might recognize them from our previous episode last month when we talked about how to choose a healthy Phalaenopsis orchid and how a sick one looks like. And today, as promised, I'll show you how to revive these orchids, because the good news is we can actually save them. All we need is a little bit of know-how and patience. Today's video is sponsored, as always, by repot.me.com, who is also the sponsor of this entire series. And if you're looking for orchid medium, fertilizers, and other things you can possibly need to take care of your orchid, look no further, Repot.me has it all. So I'll link you to their store down below in the description. Feel free to visit them and check out their store at any time. I will also share with you the other episode of this series. This is actually the 10th episode, so there are 9 more orchid tutorials for beginners, and this one will be no different. Don't be intimidated by how these orchids look like. I do believe they are savable, and it really is simple. So they're not beyond the point of no return. Let's just take them one by one, assess their situation, and see why they look like they do and what to do about them. Our first orchid, I believe, is the healthiest one, but at a first glance, we can see that the leaves are dehydrated. We have very limpy and wrinkly leaves. If I try to bend them, I can do so without much opposition. This is a clear sign of dehydration. Now, dehydration happens when the orchid doesn't actually absorb water, and this can happen if the orchid is not watered properly, but also if the root system is missing. So we need to determine what's the case here. Looking at the root system, we can see that it is dry indeed, but I don't believe we have many dead roots. They don't appear to be papery or mushy in any way. So I do believe the cause of dehydration is lack of water, not lack of roots. As a bonus, this plant has a little baby. Growers call them keikis, and they are actually baby orchids. In this case, we have a basal keiki, meaning it sprouts from the stem of the orchid rather than the flower spike. If you take a close look at the keiki, you will see that it actually has no roots. So not only this orchid is trying to maintain itself hydrated, but also the keiki. Baby plants withdraw a lot of energy from their mothers until they create roots of their own. So this orchid is in serious need of water. Just like the mother plant, the keiki is extremely dehydrated, but it doesn't look bad. We don't have very dark or yellowing patches. Also, we do seem to have a brand new leaf growing here, so the orchid is trying to survive and grow. This is a very good sign, because it seems like the crown is not affected by anything, so it can grow, and also the stem doesn't seem to be affected by stem rot. So overall, I do believe this orchid is just suffering from extreme neglect, which is the easiest thing to cure. Our second orchid looks to be very dehydrated as well. The leaves are limpy, and if I want to bend them, I can do so easily, which never happens with a healthy Phalaenopsis. So again, this orchid might be neglected, but might also lack roots. Taking a look in the pot, we can see that the roots are seriously lacking. This one doesn't have nearly as many roots as the other one. We do have some roots here on top of the medium, which is great. They will tremendously help the orchid. But when we water orchids, what we actually do is wet the medium, and the medium will deliver the water. Check out our second episode of the series. I talk more about watering there. So this orchid only has roots at the top, where usually the atmosphere is a lot drier. If we don't have roots inside the pot, then this orchid, even if watered, doesn't hydrate itself properly. So in this case, this orchid might suffer from neglect, but also it definitely suffers from root loss. So we need to address that. I'm happy to see that the crown looks okay, there are no yellow or dark patches, and also the stem appears to be in good condition. We had a leaf drop from here, but it could be normal. Bottom leaves could drop as part of regeneration. They sometimes drop as part of stress or dehydration. So this yellow leaf remain doesn't necessarily mean anything. The stem is not darkened or yellow, so that is a good sign. And lastly, our third orchid, which looks the worst in my opinion. You don't even understand what's happening here. So again, we see signs of extreme dehydration, but also a yellow leaf which fell off. And it doesn't appear to be the only leaf falling. If you look at the stem, we can see dried and yellow remains of previous leaves. That is not a very good sign. In extreme cases, it could mean stem rot. But most of the times it is a response to dehydration and stress. The orchid is just eliminating structures just because it doesn't have enough energy to keep them. We can also see that it is trying to grow a new leaf here. It does not look normal, it's a bit misshapen. That is again a sign of stress and dehydration. The more an orchid stays dehydrated and stressed, the worse it will look because it will start losing structures. And that's never good, but it doesn't mean it's irreversible. So my hope is that we can save even this orchid. But let's determine what caused dehydration. Could it be neglect? Well, I think it is. But also, I'm thinking that we do have a root issue as well. We can see these roots are present in the medium, but taking a very close look at them, we can see that they don't have substance. They look rather papery. So I'm guessing that we do have a lot of dead roots here. The good news is we appear to have some good roots as well, but very, very little. So even if this orchid looks quite bad and it already lost leaves, I don't believe it is a lost case. In cases of neglect, as you could see with all three of them, it is important to first hydrate the orchids. Some of these orchids don't have a lot of roots, yes, but at this point, I'm not entirely sure how many good roots I have on each orchid. So even if I have one good root on an orchid, it is still important to try and hydrate the orchid through that root. I will hydrate the orchids by submerging the orchid pots in a separate container with water. This form of watering is very suited for dehydrated orchids or orchids which are potted in chunky medium. Being that I have extremely dehydrated orchids, this will be a lot more beneficial than just running water through the pot and risking not actually reaching all the roots. I will keep the orchids in these containers for about 10 to 15 minutes. That is enough to properly soak the orchids, and afterwards we will repot them. After about 15 minutes, the root system is soaked, so I will be taking them out, let them drain, dispose of this water, and come back with the repotting. First of all, I will remove the flower spike. In this case, we can see that the spike is already dried, there are no more flowers. So no matter if I remove it or not, this spike will not rebloom again. Even if the orchid wouldn't have been sick, I would still remove a dried flower spike because it serves no purpose and it will not rebloom. I will use a pair of pruners and try to cut it as close to the base of the orchid as possible without damaging it. Now we want to repot these sick orchids because one, we want to have access to the root system and cut away everything that is mushy and dead, and second, even if I suspect that neglect is the main cause of demise for this orchid, maybe the medium has something to do with it as well. It might be already broken down and affecting the roots. It certainly does not look too fresh and it doesn't smell good either, so I want to offer this orchid a fresh new start in fresh medium. I talk more in detail about repotting in our first episode of the series, so check that one out. If you want the full tutorial, today we will speed things up. I'm happy to say that this orchid's root system looks pretty good. There are only a few dead roots which I will need to remove. So I will use my sterilized pair of pruners, and whatever root is mushy or papery or leaves behind a string, has no substance, I will cut away. These are dead roots, they will not rejuvenate themselves. So at this point, I am pretty much done with cutting away all of the dead roots, and look at this root system. It's actually in pretty good condition. I also removed as much of the older medium as I possibly could, and to finish the job, I will go at the sink and rinse the root system thoroughly with lukewarm water, simply to remove all of this debris left behind. Alrighty, given that my orchid has actually a very good root system, I will be potting it in an appropriate pot. I'm gonna use a 5-inch diameter pot. I prefer to pot all of my orchids in pots which have ventilation slits or ventilation holes. And this will make sure that the roots do have air, which is very important with Phalaenopsis orchids. So again, I'll speed up the process. You can learn more about the different type of media you can use with Phalaenopsis depending on your environment in our first episode, which you will find down below. and my orchid is repotted. As you noticed, I used a medium consisting of chunkier bark chips and also sphagnum moss. I do live in a warm climate, so the water retentive capabilities of sphagnum moss help me out, but also this orchid absolutely needs hydration, especially in the next month. And sphagnum moss will make sure that I will not need to water this orchid all that frequent, and it will also deliver water to the roots for longer. So in the days to come, I will make sure that this orchid stays rather damp, not soggy, but not dry. Not watering Phalaenopsis orchids after repotting is, in my opinion, a bad idea. And for dehydrated orchids, it's especially bad. So I'll go ahead and run some water through the pot just to make sure that that moss is really wet. My next orchid does not have a dry flower spike. It is actually pretty green. It is not blooming anymore, but it can actually produce a secondary branch. Even so, I will remove the flower spike. If the orchid will try to produce a secondary spike, it will put energy into that flowering. And at this point, the orchid doesn't have enough energy to sustain itself, let alone a new flowering. But now, I want the mother orchid to be fine, and afterwards, we will induce blooming the next season. So again, using a sterilized pair of pruners, I will cut the flower spike close to the base, as much as to not damage the plant. And here are some unforeseen surprises. This orchid still has the seedling plug attached. It was never removed. This seedling plug is very old and this medium is very broken down. As a consequence of that, the central root system really doesn't look so good. It's pretty much gone. You can see that this root actually has some segments which are green. Typically, I will let them be, but the more I look at this root system, the more I'm sure it will not make it. This section not only has its initial section dried, but also the ending section as well. So in the end, this root is slowly and surely drying off. It's not actually feeding the orchid. The roots which are alive on the orchid are the top ones. So I will go ahead and cut everything that's mushy and only leave the top ones. Being that this orchid doesn't have too many roots, barely any roots at all, I will be using a slightly smaller pot, which will balance out a little bit the water retention with the medium. I still want my medium to retain water, but I still want it to have air pockets, be ventilated, so that it can deliver both water and air at the same time. And with this orchid, even though these roots were on the top, they weren't inside the medium, when they're wet, they are very flexible, so I can reshape them a little bit. I will make sure that this root will be placed under the orchid just so it benefits of more moisture. If I would leave it at the top, I would need to spray it or water it every day, which I might not be able to do. Now, when roots grow, they adapt to the environment in which they grow. Meaning, if they have a lot of air in their environment, they will be adapted to a lot of air. So putting them in a very water retentive medium might suffocate them. So I will make sure that the top layer will not be only sphagnum moss. There will be some bark there to offer aeration. So what I want to achieve is a humid but airy environment, so that this root will not be shocked, but it will receive moisture. And here is my orchid potted. Many of the times using a pre-made mix is actually very helpful for beginners, but in these instances, which are slightly more advanced, purchasing media separately, not in a mix, can come in handy, because I can actually control where I arrange my sphagnum moss and where the bark. As for our third orchid, we can see that the flower spikes have already been cut, so there's no preparation needed. It's time to repot. So I cut away all of the dead roots and this is what I'm left with. I also shortened the dried flower spikes. And one more thing I want to do is remove these dried sheaths. When they dry, they become very tough. So if new roots want to sprout from here, they will have a bit of a hard time. So wherever I can, I will remove these sheaths. If they don't want to come loose, then I will not insist. But as you saw, this one was very easy to remove. This one is easy to remove as well. If these sheaths are still green, do not remove them. And there we have it. I wanted to expose the stem just a little bit more to make the life of the new roots a little easier. As you saw, all of my previous orchids did have a little bit of a root system. And most of the times, orchids will have a little stump, a little root to work with, and that will help the orchid get hydrated. But in the cases in which the orchid has absolutely no root at all, I would go about things in a similar manner. However, it is more important for these orchids to have humidity around the base. In my experience, this will assist roots in their growth. Naturally, the orchid will start to produce new roots, but by providing higher humidity, especially around the stem area, we make sure that those roots will not dry out and they will grow as fast as they can. My preferred way is to use a separate container with sphagnum moss that I will keep damp at all times and simply place the orchid on top of it. No need to actually pot it or do any type of mixes. When I see the roots starting to grow, I usually go ahead and pot it up. But you don't necessarily have to do this. You can actually pot this orchid like we did with the previous ones, but keep the top of the medium moist. If it's bark, just make sure to spray the top with some water. If it's moss, make sure the top is constantly damp. This works absolutely fantastic, but it requires more time because typically the top of the medium will dry out within a day. So if you don't have the available time to spray it or dampen it every day, I find that this separate container with moss helps because it maintains that water for quite a few more days. And here are my orchids repotted and ready for a new life. Now, I didn't see any pests, so there is no need for me to apply any substances. I didn't see any infections on the leaves, so there was no reason for me to cut away any portion of the leaves. If your orchid does have an infection, obviously remove it, and I show you in my previous video how to do that. You have it in the description. And what I will do now is place these orchids in bright shade. I will not put them in the sun, because Phalaenopsis orchids generally don't like sun, and these orchids are very sensitive and they might get burned a lot easier than a healthy Phalaenopsis, but I will not keep them in darkness or intense shade either. They need to receive light, photosynthesize, prepare their food, and grow. The temperature will be adequate for Phalaenopsis orchids. Average home temperatures are usually ideal for Phalaenopsis, and of course I will make sure that they're never super bone dry. Another tip for dehydrated orchids: when the leaves are so flexible, you can actually shape them a little bit. So in this case, you can see the keiki has flopped over. If I let this be right now, when the leaves harden, it will take this shape, which is not ideal because new leaves will just grow a little curly. So what I can do now is place the leaf on this side and make sure that I support it somehow. I think this leaf of the mother plant will support it. So when the leaf hardens off, it will look like this. So I'll have a free crown. Also, I have a twisty leaf here in the back. If I untwist it and kind of support it on this leaf, I make sure that when it hardens, it looks normal and not twisted. I did the same thing for this orchid. If you remember, the leaf looked like this, but now I want it to look normal. And luckily the leaf is heavy enough to just stay like this. If it wouldn't have been heavy, I would have put something here that would maintain the leaf in this position. This orchid looks okay shape-wise. So with all of that said, it is time to wait. For you guys, it's going to be a second. For me, it's going to be about a month. So I will see you guys then. So about 1 month has passed. It is time to check on our orchids and see how they're doing. And from a first glance, we can see that they're all still around and looking much better. So let's just take them one by one. So our first orchid, which we determined was the healthiest, is looking the best because we already had a great root system, which is still in pretty good condition. Even if the spot is not fully transparent, we can see the roots already starting to grow. This is a root tip here. Not only is the orchid hydrated and growing, but it is also producing new roots. A month ago, this new leaf was grown only up to here, and in the meantime, look how much it grew and how good it looks. Yes, the leaves is a lot smaller and thinner than the previous leaves, but it looks so much glossier and so much better. We can actually see the line which makes the difference between the stressed growth and the healthy growth. Since this orchid has been through tremendous stress, it is absolutely normal if this leaf is smaller than the previous ones. Also, take a look at the keiki. He's looking a lot better as well. The leaves are not limpy anymore. I cannot easily bend them anymore, and I will not attempt to. We can see though that at some point in the past the orchid was stressed. Even though the leaves are hydrated now, we can still see a few wrinkles, and that is absolutely fine. Some marks will still remain, but the orchid looks 1,000 times better, and I would say that she is absolutely saved. Our second orchid is looking fantastic as well. We can see that the leaves are not dehydrated anymore, and now if I want to bend them, I am afraid that I'm gonna snap them. They are so hydrated now, not even a sign of a wrinkle. So she made a full recovery, and if you remember, this was the orchid that had aerial roots on top of the medium and we tucked them in. Well, the roots survived, and moreover, not only did they hydrate the orchid, but they're already starting to produce new root tips. We also have a brand new leaf on top of the orchid, so again, this orchid is absolutely saved. All it needs to do now is focus on root production, and as long as we maintain it hydrated, everything should be just fine. And our last orchid, the one that looked the worst, is still looking the worst. But as it turns out, this orchid was losing leaves not because of stem rot, but because of stress. Now, just a few minutes ago, you saw me remove the sheaths from the stem, and I did this to make the life of the new roots easier. And let's just take a look at the stem. Do we see how many root tips are starting to poke through? We have 1, 2, 3, 4 root tips emerging at this point, and they will continue to grow unbothered and undamaged because we did actually remove those leaf remains. And that was my hope for this orchid. Of course, it will take longer for this one to recuperate because it was the most stressed, but I think you can agree that it does look quite a lot better than it used to. This leaf still shows signs of dehydration, and it might never actually recover. If the damage is so advanced that it actually completely compromised the structure of the leaf, then the leaf will be lost. But that is okay because we do have this leaf and a brand new leaf on the way. We also have new roots on the way, so all we need to do is continue to care for the orchid and baby it. Recoup will take a while, probably for the next year. It will not look spectacular, but slowly and surely each new leaf will look better and better. What was the most important is that we did not have stem rot and that we made the life of the new roots easier. We can see that on the top here, we have some dead roots. I can go ahead and cut them because we're not relying on them anymore. We will have new roots which will hydrate the orchid. And again, we end the video with a success story. The rootless orchid you saw after these is not doing anything just yet because it's a much more recent purchase. So it will take a while for that one to start new root production, but I do suspect it will have pretty much the same story as this one. The less roots we have to work with, the more the recoup will take. And speaking about that, as you could see, within a month, all of my orchids started to move, to produce something. The first one is growing much faster than both of these because it had more roots, but it varies. Some orchids will start to produce roots after 1.5 months, after 2 months, after 2 weeks. It really depends on the orchid, how much energy it has, the amount of stress it went through, and so on and so forth. But typically within the first 2 months, maybe 3, you'll have something starting on your orchid. And I'm happy to say that in the vast majority of cases, this will be the outcome. There are a few cases though which cannot be solved. As I was saying, stem rot, crown rot, these are things that are hard to treat even for advanced growers. So it's always better to prevent, and of course we do have an episode which talks all about Phalaenopsis ailments. I will link you to it down below, and I think with that said, it is time to end. Hope this video was useful for you guys, and don't worry if your orchid manages to get to the very stressed point. We've all been there, we all learned from our mistakes, and I hope this video will just give you some ideas and some hopes that you can save your orchid. So you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. Thank you Repot for sponsoring this video and making this series possible. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!